Good morning. I'm Carlos Fernandez, Policy Analyst at the Vegas Chamber. I'd like to thank you all for tuning in to our federal update on COVID-19 Business Assistance Call with the Vegas Chamber President and CEO, Mary Beth Sewald, Congressman John Porter, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Executive Director of Congressional Public Affairs, Allison Denbeck. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to explain some features of this call. In order to preserve a high sound quality, we'll be muting everyone on the call besides our presenter to make it easier for everyone to hear. If you'd like to ask questions, there are a few ways you can do so. If you're joining this call on the web or through the mobile app, you can ask a question by using the chat feature on the interface. We'll ask a question on your behalf. You can ask a question by clicking the hand raise button on the interface as well. We will call your name and unmute your line so you can ask your question. Once you have asked your question, we'll remute your line so everyone on the call can hear the answer. In order to preserve time, we ask that you please keep questions brief. We'll be taking all questions at the end of the call. And now please welcome the Vegas Chamber's President and CEO, Mary Beth Sewald.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Carlos. I really appreciate that. Good morning to everybody, and thank you to all of our businesses throughout Nevada that are joining us on today's teleconference. We at the Vegas Chamber are pleased to partner with the Las Vegas Global Economic Alliance, as well as chambers of commerce from across our entire state. We're all working together to help our businesses and employees navigate through this incredibly difficult and unprecedented time. I want to give you a very brief update on all that the Vegas Chamber is doing to support our members and to hopefully help our community. We've been in constant contact with leaders from our congressional delegation to the governor and his staff, legislators, County Commissioner Marilyn Kirkpatrick, local governments, and also education leaders. Also, the Vegas Chamber is assembling trade association leaders, including trucking, retail, restaurants, resorts, and banking from across the state on weekly calls. What we're trying to do with this is to make sure that our business community is coordinating efforts, which is so important right now. We are also keeping in touch with our congressional delegation. On Monday, we held a town hall with Congresswoman Dina Titus to get her perspective on the response to the coronavirus and federal legislation to address it. I also spoke with Senator Cortez Masto yesterday, and then this morning I was on a call with Congressman Amodei. He briefed me about financial resources that are being passed by Congress to help businesses, including small businesses and also our tourism industry. We're definitely keeping in close contact with him on pending legislation. Yesterday, the Vegas Chamber sent a letter to more than 650 members of Congress, Senate, House, and committee staff asking them to include the hotel, resort, and casino industry in legislation giving financial assistance to industries hardest impacted by COVID-19. Also, the Vegas Chamber is working closely with the Small Business Administration. We did a webinar on Tuesday with SBA District Director Joe Amato on emergency disaster loans for small businesses and nonprofits. And now we're scheduling a follow-up webinar with the latest information for next week, and we'll be sure to get that information to you. Finally, the Vegas Chamber has been working with Nevada Trucking Association and the Nevada Retail Association, and we are happy to report that our supply chain is stable and meeting demand. We appreciate the business community for doing your part of working remotely, being innovative, and supporting each other and the entire community. And now it is my pleasure to introduce former Congressman John Porter of the Porter Group, who will give us an update on the latest in Washington, D.C. John, good morning.
Good morning, and thank you, Mary Beth, and to all the members that are on the line today. This is one of those days when I wish I was in Nevada. Because of all the changes that are taking place. But as you know, we are based in Washington, D.C., although a Nevada corporation, but we're here. My team is here, although we are distance commuting via technology right now. But Mary Beth has asked me to give you kind of an update on some of the things that the Chamber has been working on, and in concert with some of the things that we're doing as well across the state of Nevada with our delegation. First and foremost, kudos to Mary Beth, the Chamber, for being in front of this issue for a number of weeks now and preparing for where we are today. Been working very closely with the Nevada delegation, and certainly the Chamber has been working closely with other members of Congress across the country. And for those that have been with the Chamber for some time, you will remember that part of the mission of the Chamber with its fly-ins each year is to create a relationship with policymakers from across the country Many of us experienced the challenges of the Katrina and the financial and personal loss in Missouri and Mississippi and Louisiana. The goal of the Chamber for a number of years and accelerating each year is to create relationships with our national leaders. We are in a far better shape today than we've ever been in our relations beyond the Nevada borders, and kudos to the Chamber. In fact, having a mailing list of 650 staff and members that Mary Beth talked about that we're reaching out to is, again, a credit to the Chamber and its hard work. A few things, again, I want to make sure everyone is healthy. We want to make sure that you and your families are safe and secure, and certainly happy to answer any questions beyond the day that we can help with or via the Chamber. So what's happening in Washington today? I have this sense that we're about 5 or 6 days ahead of what's happening in Nevada. And I'm not saying that specifically from the resort community, but I think the rest of the community, the Washington, D.C. area, about a week ago today, really started doing the distance work and telecommuting. Started gradually, but I would guess that a good share of all the business and industry in and around the DC region are now working via conference lines and or telephones, of course. We've experienced some technical challenges here because of the load on some of the technology systems with people wireless and, again, commuting electronically. So I encourage all of you, as you do your conference calls, make sure you have secure lines, as the Chamber has done today. Again, it's for more of a capacity, and I'm sure that our experts in technology are working on that as we speak. Congress itself is struggling with ways to vote. As you can imagine, members of Congress and the U.S. Senate, as they find a way to, one, communicate with their constituents, but also communicate with each other, also stay on top of legislation as it is rapidly coming before them to make decisions on. There has been probably, I would get, again, this is changing by the minute, so I may be off by a half hour, but we know of a number of members of the House that have contracted the virus, a number of offices that have already quarantined on Capitol Hill, and in the Senate as well. As you may note that last week, the House and the Senate prevented any public access to any of the House and Senate facilities. So there's been a logistics situation. Fortunately, again, the Chamber has direct contact with the delegation, and as Mary Beth mentioned, on an almost daily basis, communicating directly with our elected officials and certainly their staff as well. Back to operations on the Hill. Again, historically, Congress and the Senate have not done remote voting, and they've debated it for a number of years, but they've chosen not to, even to this point. There are some tools available for them that they're considering, and it's called unanimous consent, and I'll talk to anyone later about some of the processes, but there are ways for them to do voting, whether it be social distancing and or just through the process of unanimous consent, where really one person can speak on behalf of the full body. Number of pieces of legislation that have been flying through Congress, and I applaud both the Democrats and Republicans for working together, closely realizing the magnitude of this situation, and with the White House. The Senate last night passed legislation in concert with the House bill that was passed on Friday. The House of Representatives they're on recess today. They had planned this recess, so most are not in Washington, D.C., although the Senate is passed that bill, a companion bill to the House bill last night. We're analyzing that as we speak. Also, the White House has proposed another additional $1 trillion+. In fairness to the House and the Senate and the White House, they really have had a priority in this legislation to help support business, realizing that that's the lifeblood of our communities. Something of interest that the Chamber will be following up on with additional conversations is that the President has special powers under what's called the Defense Production Act It's been around since the Korean War. It does not take an act of Congress. Congress has already acted, which is going to give him additional abilities to prioritize government contracts for materials and services, help to allocate general distribution of materials and services and facilities that have to do with promoting national defense. Now, not only on the side of the federal government and Homeland Security, it also is very germane to our cities and counties in the state of Nevada, making sure there's ample personal protection equipment for our first responders. There has been some challenges, but I believe that being handled on some of the personal protective equipment. But that is a number one priority of the president invoking the Defense Production Act. It also provides for an expansion of Homeland Security products and capacity and supplies. So again, for a follow-up for the chamber, this is something we're going to drill into, so you'll have more information as quickly as possible for the members on the phone. Certainly a priority for Nevada, our resort industry, and of course we're fortunate to all be a part of the resort industry, but we're seeing likely close to $150 billion in relief for the hotel, casino, tourism industry from the president's new proposal, close to $50 billion in relief for the airline industry, close to $500 billion to be dispersed in checks to individual citizens, and another $300 billion in funds for small businesses for loans. Again, the chamber, it was Foresight had the call with the Small Business Association, Small Business Administration, where these funds are now being determined. The other part of this that's a real positive is that under the Defense Production Act, will be directly to FEMA, where we have a strong relationship with individuals at FEMA as well. So there's a lot going on. Again, I could spend a better part of the afternoon, but want you to know that we're working as a team on your behalf. Local communities that we represent, both in Northern Nevada and Southern Nevada, from cities to counties to airports to convention authorities, all are very much trying to coordinate their efforts in making sure as these funds become available, they are readily available to our communities. A number of these funds on the first wave of the House and Senate bill go directly to state programs. There are a number of programs that go more to individual communities, but we're looking forward to helping expand and protect and provide additional revenues for our first responders and certainly for our local community governments. So, Mary Beth, again, I'm on the call for the rest of the duration. I have to answer any questions. And again, thank you for this opportunity, and please be safe, everyone.
Okay, John, thank you so much. We really appreciate all your work in DC, and we want you to stay safe too. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Allison Dembeck. She's the Executive Director of Congressional and Public Affairs at the U.S. Chamber, where she focuses on education, labor, and workforce development issues. Prior to her role at the U.S. Chamber, Allison worked on education and workforce issues for the Senate Republican Policy Committee, as well as Senator John Barrasso and Senator Judd Gregg. We're honored to have her share her expertise today with all of you. So please welcome Allison Dembeck. Allison.
Thank you so much for asking me to come talk. I hope everybody is has a chance to be able to be home and be safe. So as the congressman mentioned, Congress has been very busy trying to pass relief legislation. There was appropriations bills done a couple weeks ago now. We're referring to that as phase 1 legislation. Phase 2 legislation, the Senate passed last night. It was the legislation that the House had passed, and the President signed it last night. So, and I will talk with you more about the details of that, but that's where the paid leave provisions are. It's where a lot of the hunger provisions dealing with SNAP and food assistance, all of that was included in this phase 2 legislation. And phase 3 legislation is in the works. I think actually while we have been on this webinar, while we've been on this webinar, it looks like the Senate has released some ideas of what that phase 3 legislation will be, and that they have now started talking. I guess really it's a Republican plan right now. They've now started talking with the Democrats to make sure that they can move it bipartisanly, but it sounds like phase 3 is focusing on federally guaranteed loans, direct financial assistance, lending institutions, and how they can work with the loans and how to have them be repaid, and then the general kind of removing health barriers and speeding up innovation and funding hospitals and that sort of thing. And the congressman touched on a lot of the specifics that are being talked about in those areas. I should also say that Senator McConnell had pulled together 4 task forces to continue looking at legislation, because to be honest, while we're already talking about phase 3 legislation, I suspect we will have phase 4 and phase 5 and phase 6. And those task forces are focusing on small business liquidity, financial assistance to individuals, airline assistance, and money markets. So in general, that's kind of where those big buckets are coming from, and we'll start to see those roll out. So with that, let me dig in a little bit to what was signed into law last night, since that's really what your businesses are going to be focusing on right now. That legislation really created a continuum of leave for employees. It put into effect some paid sick leave, some paid family medical leave, and then it made some temporary changes to UI, to unemployment compensation. I will say everything in the bill is specifically related to COVID-19. So I know that there are concerns about these provisions being made permanent. They are not permanent. They are specifically for this this particular pandemic, and the paid sick leave and paid family medical leave provisions all sunset on December 31st, 2020. So it's already in statute. So I just want to put that out there to begin with. The paid sick leave and the paid family medical leave, they apply to employers with less than 500 employees. I know there's been some confusion about that as well, but it's for employers with less than 500 employees. And the way the paid sick leave works is that for full-time employees, it's 10 days of paid sick time. For part-time employees, it's paid sick time for the typical number of hours that employee would work in a 2-week period. The sick leave is in addition to whatever sick leave that the employer already offers, including the state and local requirements of what is offered. So this is in addition to that. And there's 2 sorts of eligibility requirements. Basically, if the employee is subject to a government quarantine, if the health provider has said that the individual should self-quarantine, or if the person is experiencing symptoms of COVID-19 and is seeking medical diagnosis, waiting for a test, that sort of thing, those individuals need to be compensated at their regular rate, the federal minimum wage rate, or the local minimum wage rate, whichever is higher. But that amount doesn't exceed $511 per day, or $5,110 in the aggregate. Now, if the person is out because they're caring for somebody else who is under a quarantine or self-quarantine order, if they're caring for children whose schools are closed or their daycare is closed, or if the person is experiencing conditions that have been outlined by the U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services, but isn't seeking medical diagnosis, those individuals get compensated at 2/3 of the rate of what their normal pay would be. And that also has a cap at $200 per day, or $2,000 in the aggregate. There are a couple of exceptions to all of this. Employers who are healthcare providers or emergency responders may be excluded. And we're waiting on regulations from the Department of Labor Secretary, but the Department of Labor Secretary may be able to provide an exemption to employers who have less than 50 employees if that employee, if the leave is about taking the time to give care or childcare, to give care to a child when their schools are closed, and if the business would be jeopardized by providing that leave. So it's only in that one instance does that exception apply. All of the paid leave is paid sick leave is 100% refundable through the payroll tax credit. So every quarter, the refund would be available. It's also important to note that anybody who is self-employed and would be eligible for any of those leave conditions, if they had been employed by another employer, would be able to take that tax credit themselves. So there's that for the self-employed. Now, once you've gone through the 10 days of sick leave, that's when the paid family medical leave comes in, the paid FMLA leave. That is for 12 weeks of paid FMLA, and that is only in the instances of somebody being out to care for a child if the schools are closed or the daycare is closed, and if that individual is ineligible for telework. So if telework is an option, then that individual does not get paid leave. It's also important to note that that person, similar to other FMLA rules, that person needs to be employed for at least 30 days in order to be eligible for that. Again, there are the same kind of exclusions about healthcare providers and about the employers who have fewer than 50 employees if the requirement is going to jeopardize their business. And the reimbursement, there's also the quarterly reimbursement that is 100% refundable. And lastly, that brings us to the unemployment compensation side of it. And the Department of Labor has already regulated, saying that the rules are a little different under COVID-19, that giving some flexibility is in recognizing that some people are not necessarily actually unemployed, but their places of business have closed down, so that they can then be eligible for unemployment insurance. This goes beyond and waives the requirements for the waiting period, because there's the waiting period before eligibility. So the bill will waives those waiting periods. It also waives the requirement that individuals be available, and actively looking for work. So there's no need for that. However, it's important to note that this is not sick leave. This is about having the place of business be closed, since a lot of states and localities are putting those requirements down on businesses. The other aspect is that the unemployment benefits are actually extended beyond the usual 26 weeks. So recognizing that 26 weeks may not be enough. And the bill provides $1 billion going to the state unemployment programs in order to help fund that. So I think I will stop there too. I'm sure there are lots of questions, and I'm happy to answer what I can.
Okay, Allison, thank you very much. I really appreciate all of your information there. We do have a couple of questions here. I think this one might be more for John. I know, John, you discussed the different amounts of money that are going to the different hotel, air, and so forth. This question is, how much money was allocated for airline relief, and how much is allocated for SBA loans? I'm not sure you mentioned SBA loans, or was that $300 billion?
Thank you for asking. Airline industry was $50 billion. I do not have the latest number on SBA. Allison, maybe would you have the most recent? I don't have that at the moment.
I was just trying to see if I could grab it while you were answering the question. I do not have it handy.
Well, we can get that for you before the end of the call, because we do have to document that information. So before we conclude, we'll be happy to answer that question.
Okay, very good. We're going to take a question from one of our audience members, Andy Freeman. If you can unmute your phone, and we'll let you ask your question live. Andy, are you there?
Where do we unmute?
It's on mute.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can
Hello?
hear you.
Hi, I wanted to see if there was any relief for the trade show industry. You know, we were doing, you know, quite well until, you know, all the trade shows were canceled, and you know, we've got extremely high monthly expenses for our business, and I wanted to see if there was any relief for the trade show industry, since I mean, it sounds like we're going to be out of work for quite a few months, and we still have to pay the, you know, the rent on the warehouse, all the insurance. I mean, you name it, the list goes on.
I do not know specifically, other than they are addressing this as an industry effect with the 150 billion for the affected industries of hotel, casino, and tourism. But it's important that you mention that, and then as we're communicating with our delegation, we'll make sure that that's shared as well. But it is specific to the industry, which is a pretty broad, which is a real positive thing. Now, there also is additional monies that technically go into a fund that has not been designated yet. So I think the louder we can send that message, and we're happy to do that you guys need to be included. I'm glad you mentioned it.
Okay. I have a question
as,
here. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, as of now, the trade show industry is not included in that, as far as you know.
Well, I guess in fairness, that bill is coming before Congress this week. So we'll have a better idea once it's actually language. This is just categories right now that the White House has mentioned. So we'll watch very closely for you, because again, it's just a broad statement at the moment.
Okay.
At this point, my understanding is at this point they're trying to negotiate a lot of it out and develop the language. The language itself has not been developed yet, and they're also trying to make sure, kind of to the congressman's earlier point, they're trying to make sure that what's being done in the Senate right now is being done bipartisanly, because the House members are not here to vote, and the House leadership has said that they are not bringing individuals back to vote until there is a bipartisan deal. And so it's everything's a little bit in flux. They want to make sure that the language is pretty well baked before bringing people back here to vote.
And I guess I should ask on that. I know there's probably a lot of other questions, but is there a trade organization that you guys are a part of? We're happy to reach out to them to get additional information if you'd like.
You know what, John, we'll find out about that.
Yes, thank you.
I think Andy's probably off the line, but we'll find out about a trade organization. Thank you. There are an awful lot of questions coming in. One is about payroll tax credit. So do we get the payroll tax credit automatically, or do we have to apply for it? Or is there a special filing document that either of you knows of?
I believe that you will have to apply for it, but I don't know that there's a special filing document. I think some of this is actually being worked out kind of in real time. So I will have to get back to you on that for sure, but
okay, no problem. Allison, do you know the bill number that? Sorry, Allison,
yeah,
do you know the bill number that was signed last night?
HR 6201.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Now we have a call. Sharon Gorman is on the line. Sharon, if you could unmute your line and we'll take your question if you're still there.
My question was, how do we figure out if someone does qualify for this? Like, I have one employee who is herself on leave because her 1-year-old is watched by an 85-year-old who's no longer willing to watch the baby since she has exposure at work. So her daycare is not technically closed. It's a private person, but she no longer has daycare. Would someone like that qualify? And how do we make sure people qualify before we start paying them leave?
I think I can only answer at this stage. This is evolving, so we're just kind of top line right now, letting you know some of the positive things that are happening from leadership from the U.S. Chamber and, of course, the Vegas Chamber. So some of these things, we don't know all the details yet, other than we know there's a program, and I know that we can loop back around once there's more details. Happy to with the Chamber and certainly with the U.S. Chamber. So some of these we're not going to know yet, but we do know that there is relief on its way. And as this evolves, I would guess by Monday we'll have a better idea what it really means. So sometimes some of these we're not going to be able to give you specifics yet, but we're happy to note that there's funds, and now we're dissecting where they can go. By the way, it's 300 billion. Let's see, for 300 billion for SBA loans in phase 3. To answer Andy's question.
Okay, thank you, John. Appreciate that. We also have another caller on the line. If you'll unmute your line, Mary Durbino has a question. If you'll unmute your line, we'll take your question. Okay, it might be that we lost Mary. We have another question here. Could you please, I know you already said this, but this question is, could you please restate the 3 triggers for the new expanded sick leave requirements, please?
Sure. So for full compensation, the individual must be either subject to a government quarantine or isolation order. They must be advised by a health provider to self-quarantine, or they must be experiencing symptoms of COVID-19 and seeking a medical diagnosis. For the 2/3 of rate pay, the individual must be caring for somebody who is under a quarantine order or self-quarantine, must have children whose schools or caregivers are unavailable because of COVID-19, or the person is experiencing symptoms or in conditions outlined by the Secretary of Health and Human Services, but is not currently under medical care.
Okay, the next question is about unemployment. Is there any relief or options? Are there any options for those who don't normally qualify for unemployment, such as 1099 employees or owners of companies who are out of work?
I don't know the answer to that, to be honest. I don't recall seeing anything specifically about self-employed with the unemployment compensation. It was specifically everything I remember seeing was about the FMLA and the paid sick leave. So I have to get back to you on that.
Okay, sounds good. The photography companies are mostly work for hire. This question is that they are hired by conventions and events that are all canceled. Will there be some relief for this industry? And we kind of touched on that a little, I think, but some clarification perhaps.
I think, again, right now we just really have top line information as it's evolving, because once, and let me step back for a second. So as Congress, the House and the Senate come together with legislation, it then goes to the White House. This is just a general rule. It goes to the White House for final approval. And then what happens is the administration, working with the House and Senate, determine the actual regulations and implementation. So some of that has yet to happen. So a lot, again, I'm sorry we're not able to answer yet, but we will be soon able to come up with, to answer some of your questions. But of note, what happens is, again, it's passed by both houses. It then goes to the White House. So that Friday's bill passed by the Senate last night went to the White House today. So they're right now just drafting up a lot of the regulations. But if possible, I could add a few other things, just specifically. So the Treasury Department, it released $1 trillion as of today. That would include specific bailouts and payments to individual taxpayers, 2 rounds of direct payments to taxpayers, one on April 6th and one on May 18th, which is $250 billion each. The amounts would be based on income level and family size. There'd be $300 billion in small business loans, as I mentioned. And of course, there's the employers with 500 employees or fewer would not be eligible for this program, but there's more programs coming. Again, the airline industry and the casinos. And I also note that the president has asked that there be deferred income tax. So for those that owe money on April 15th, make sure you file your taxes, but they've deferred the payment for 90 days. Now check with your own counselor when it comes to your own tax returns, but as is being proposed, you'll have a 90-day window for up to $1 million for personal income tax that's due, and up to $10 million for corporations that can defer without penalty, without interest for 90 days. So the government is trying to find additional ways to help individuals. Again, that alone will keep billions in the market. So those are some of the other tools that the White House and Congress and the Senate are working on.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, John. I also want to, we've got some other questions about accessibility to this information after this call. Again, we are recording this call, so we'll have the audio for you like we did on last week's call. And we will also have FAQs from this call as well that we'll be sending out in text form. So just want to let everybody know that. We have another question that we're going to ask live. Well, no, that person got dropped off. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my list here. Let's see here. Does the Nevada governor's quarantine order meet the requirement to qualify for the federal funds?
Yes, that would be considered a government. If you're talking about the paid leave requirements of being under subject to a government quarantine, I believe that the whole idea is that the things are being shut down. People are being told to stay inside. So,
yeah, I think you're right on that. Next question is, will professional service providers be eligible for relief? We are an architecture firm providing services to the casino industry.
Well, again, as we mentioned, phase 3, which where a lot of this relief is, has not been voted on yet. It's just being put together. So again, we look at all the different packages. We cannot answer that question. I know there's a lot of folks on the phone that are in that group, including my company. So we're watching closely. Again, we'll be able to, as Mary Beth said, we'll be able to get back and answer some of these questions. So they're again, with these funds, we're watching it closely so we can give you a better indication as soon as they're passed.
Okay. Thank you, John. We're still getting several questions about mortgage relief. Could you address that again? Anything in the works for that? If so, how does one apply for that program? Getting several calls about mortgage relief.
I think, again, not in law, but being discussed is a way for the financial institutions to waive fees and penalties for late payments. That is what the White House and Congress is asking the financial institutions to do, but that has not been determined yet, but it's certainly a priority, I know, for the government. And it is being discussed as we speak right now.
Okay, here's another question. As a small retailer with extraordinarily high rents in a large casino, how can we be sure the relief casinos get from the Fed will trickle down to a tenant?
Well,
Or can we?
at this stage, I don't think there's, I think what we have is a guarantee that the federal government, your local and state governments are trying to find use every weapon they have available to them to help businesses of all sizes and families and seniors and kids. Right now, the sure thing is that they are working strongly to find a priority. Phase 3 does have money for shopping centers, and we'll see how that evolves. But note that to help relief with your property owners and you as a tenant, I know that's a priority, but it is addressed in phase 3, money for shopping centers as well.
Okay, here's another question about emergency sick leave. Does this apply in addition, we may have already touched on this, does this apply in addition to already existing sick leave, or does this only apply to those who do not have a sick leave benefit?
Nope, this applies to everybody, and it's in addition to what is already offered by the employer. So if the employer offers nothing, it's in addition to that. If your employer, as an employer, if you already offer 10 days, then this is an additional 10 days.
Okay. Has there been any talk about speeding up the amount of time it takes to get an SBA loan approved, fast tracking it, or making the criteria more lax? A lot of our members of the chamber and folks have been trying to get these loans, and so this is a question we're getting a lot.
Again, generically speaking, the White House is, and especially through some of the powers that it has exclusively, is trying to find a way to cut through a lot of the bureaucracy, not only for that, but for healthcare. There's certain HIPAA requirements that they're doing their best to streamline. To answer your question, they're trying to reduce a good share of all the bureaucratic challenges. And fortunately, I know that Chamber had their call with the SBA, but that too is evolving. But another thing I assure you is they're trying to find ways to eliminate a lot of this red tape that gets in the way of relief.
Yeah, and this is Jennings too from the U.S. Chamber, and that's kind of what we've been hearing too from the SBA, is that they're trying to work around this, and they have some, kind of stringent requirements, such as if you have access to outside capital, then you wouldn't be eligible for the disaster loan. Things like that have really kind of become a problem for folks that are trying to get access to SBA loans, and I think that they're aware of that, and so they've been talking about additional kind of hardship exemptions and things like that. So it's an issue that they're aware of and that they're trying to work on actively right now.
Okay, thank you, James. This question is from Chamber Board Trustee Vicki Van Meteren. What happens to the businesses that have more than 500 employees?
So the businesses that have more than 500 employees are not eligible for any of the reimbursement for paying their sick time. They're not subject to anything in this federal law at all. If the conversations, just kind of as background, the conversations around that, it was specifically Democrats who felt that large employers should not be getting reimbursement from the federal government for their sick time, and that if you had over 500 employees, you should already be offering all of this. So,
Vicki, hi, John, thank you for your question. I'd like to reassure everyone, and I think Allison mentioned it in her opening comments, that both the House and the Senate are forming special subcommittees right now to address additional needs. So again, this is phase 1, 2, and 3, but there will be other opportunities, and I'm sure as the organizations are able to read the language, they'll be able to help coordinate that message. But I can assure you that there will be additional relief and additional measures that will, what will the outcome be? I cannot tell you. I just know there'll be additional legislation to help address these things that haven't been addressed yet.
Thank you. And John, from the briefings you're getting in DC, is there any speculation on the duration or the severity that we could continue? Because this is something obviously that none of us has ever experienced before. Is there an outlook, projection of any type that we could expect?
Well, this is not a scientific nor is this based upon information other than instincts for a moment. If we were able to track this when it was first noted in the media in December, and I think it was the 31st of December, if I'm correct. If we look at that date and then we move into the news we're hearing today from Asia that things are starting to improve, they're disassembling their temporary medical facilities, retail stores are starting to open. That's about an 8-week window. Again, this is not an expert speaking. I'm purely watching and listening to the reports that I'm receiving. That's about an 8-week. We could well be in this 2 weeks at this point. Again, this is only a John guesstimate without scientific fact. But I think a good indication for all this is to watch what's happening. So if Asia was the epicenter in January, and in February, Europe, the EU, in February to early March, I think that, and by the way, no doubt we're going to see far more cases here very soon. I mean, we are far from over, but I do think that there is light at the end of the tunnel based upon what's happening across the country. I do think that there's a lot of work that has to be done, but also of note, you're going to see a lot more positive tests because the testing capacity is increasing. Also, this is well publicized, but encouraging that our younger folks realize that a good share now of those that are being infected are not old like me. They need to be very cautious, but also the U.S. Surgeon General is asking for those healthy individuals to give as much blood as possible. That would be very timely. So there's a lot going on. The window of time, I would guess, I know that the government's asking for 2 weeks right now, especially. Part of that, of course, and Vicki would be an expert on the phone, is to prevent the taxing of our healthcare system based upon the number of individuals that are showing the signs of the virus. Part of it is to try to flatten that curve, and that's why the government and business leaders are encouraging everyone to stay home.
Okay, thanks, John. We're getting this call or this question quite a bit too. Will the relief package be given to legal residents as well as citizens, green card holders, for example? Any word on that?
Maybe Allison or Jennings, but I don't know.
I haven't heard anything about that at all. I don't know.
Okay, we'll definitely check on that, and we can include that in the frequently asked questions when we send that out after. We have one more call. Is there any relief, any discussion about relief to higher education that you've heard of?
Oh, thank you. That's a really good question. I meant to mention that in my closing. If we look closely at what's happening in Nevada, not only higher education, but primary and secondary, it's one of the challenges is delivery of food services to primary and secondary. As you know, that's the prime source for a lot of young folks for their primary meals. So I know a number of the cities, including the city of Henderson, is working closely with the Clark County School District. Another challenge for primary and secondary is distance learning, trying to find as many ways to communicate with these folks that are primary and secondary so they can continue their education. On the higher education side, also, fortunately, you know, the Nevada system of higher education has a strong background in distance learning and working with a number of their schools. But what we're trying to do is find as many grants as possible. There's opportunities moving into the future, not only from a research perspective for our systems, but also there's a number of grants that are starting to be proposed for higher education. So thank you. I actually was going to bring that up towards the end, but it is a primary concern of ours, making sure, one, that there's a place for so our families can continue to get their education, but also helping moving into the future. So it's a very good question.
And just to build on that a little bit too, the administration talked about not having interest on student loans for the time being, and there's some other conversations happening about depending on the size of your loan and not being able to pay your loan, and kind of how to deal with the student loan situation, especially with kind of talking about all of these other questions about leave and unemployment and some of these other concerns that are happening with folks in the workforce. Then how do you deal with the student loan issue? So in the same way that there are conversations about what to do in terms of being able to pay your mortgage and pay your rent, there are lots of conversations that are also happening on the student loan front. And so I suspect that there will be ways to deal with some of those issues as well.
Okay, very good. Well, I want to thank our guests today, Allison Dembeck from the U.S. Chamber, John Porter from the Porter Group, former U.S. Congressman. Thank you both very much for joining us on the call today. It was extremely informative, and I want to thank all of our members as well for being here, and all our friends. Again, we're recording this call, and we'll make it available to everyone as soon as we can get it up on our website and out on social media. And again, we'll also send frequently asked questions in print so you can have something to read as well. And again, we just want to thank everybody, and want to thank James as well from the U.S. Chamber. And we just appreciate everybody's support, and we're sticking together through this, and we'll get through it. And as always, if anybody needs anything, please feel free to give us a call directly at the Chamber. We will be doing another SBA call next week, and we'll send those details out just as soon as we have everything finalized. All right, so thank you, everybody. Stay safe and stay healthy, and we appreciate it. Bye-bye.